Okay, the way in which the words are put together, that structuring of the story, structuring of the account other than the story, so forth. And the attempt is made to show that when you try to grasp what the structure is, how it is put together, how the parts of the story interrelate, what are they referring to? You see, no interpretation really hangs together and works. Do you get it? What does it mean for an interpretation to work? Well, to make sense of the parts in a coherent fashion. You see? No interpretation does that. Makes sense of the parts in a coherent fashion. So, deconstruction is named as the antithesis, to be the antithesis of structuralism. Language simply doesn't work for conveying unequivocal meanings with any certainty and clarity. I'm inclined to say, do you remember the pre-Socratic Gorgias, the sophist? Anybody remember Gorgias? Who said, he said, nothing exists. If anything exists, I couldn't know it. If I knew it, I couldn't talk about it. You see. You find skepticism extended not only to whether something exists, not only to knowing about something, but also skepticism to the viability of any language. You see. Linguistic skepticism. And this is what's involved.
Critical realism, is that both on the author's intentionality and on the reader?
Yeah. I realize the term critical realism doesn't have much content at this juncture. It will do in another 10 days. But the nearest anticipation we have of it, I think, is Scottish realism. Back to Thomas Reid, okay, where Reid is a realist about the existence of things. It maintains that we have an immediate awareness of something's existence that is given to that becomes self-evident, is given along with certain sensory qualities which are signs that something is there. So you don't have to infer the existence of something. In other words, in the relationship between the mind and its object, what you have is a direct awareness of the existence of the object. And so existence is given directly, you see. But the nature of the object we seem to gain through reflection on those signs, those sensory stimuli, so forth. Critical realism. Critical about what it is. Now, the term critical realism itself comes from the 1920s, 1930s, when there was an American philosophical movement known as critical realism, which was essentially a continuation of the Scottish realist tradition in those 1920s and 30s. That's what we'll be talking about in a short while.
With this linguistic structure, though, how does an author understand what he's read?
He doesn't. Same problem. He doesn't. Do you ever discover that a teacher finds something in what you've written that you never thought was there? You see, doesn't the literature teacher tell us all the time that a text begins to take on a life of its own? You see? I find people writing reviews of stuff I write. I want to set them straight all the time. I've given up trying to do it. But, you see, they think I'm saying something I don't think I am saying. Once in a while, when I get into conversation with someone, but you said, oh yes, but I didn't mean that. The text says something I certainly didn't intend, consciously. Was there a subconscious? How do I know? So do I ever really understand what I mean? See, that's the way the argument would go.
Does it correspond with the Aquinas' view of the levels of interpretation?
Oh, can you tell me about that? I'm rusty on that. Yep, Eleanor Stump. Mm-hmm. Yeah, can you delineate the levels of interpretation? Yeah. No, no.
But she talks more than just an allegorical.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Like, you read it and maybe the author didn't necessarily.
Yeah. I don't remember precisely what that was. I remember very roughly that it was analogous to saying that a given passage has several levels of meaning. So that if you are taking, for instance, the book of Jonah, just as a hypothetical example, if you take the book of Jonah, you could read it as a narrative of something which actually happened. Whether or not it's intended to be or not is another question. But you could read it that way. If you do or if you don't, you can also read it as an analogy to what happened when the people of Israel ran away from God and got swallowed up by the Assyrians. You see? You could read it as that level of understanding. And of course, if you're reading it from the standpoint of the New Testament, as some people have tried to, you could read it as anticipating the resurrection of Christ, coming out from the jaws of death. You see? 3 levels of meaning. Now, that was the sort of thing, but I don't remember precisely what she meant, so don't read that to her.
Didn't she also say that God reveals the meaning he wants to?
Yeah.
Needs that particular
Yeah. Yeah, and that was, I think, the salient thing that stands out in my memory of what she was doing. You remember she talked of a deistic interpretation. Now, obviously, she didn't literally mean deist. She was just saying that some interpreters act like deists, in that they regard interpretation as an entirely human, rational, almost mechanical process. Fixed laws in the absence of God, who established the laws and left us to function by the laws. Sort of a deistic view of interpretation. And that Aquinas was, she suggested, more of a theistic kind of interpretation, in the sense that God is active in the interpretive process, in showing, illuminating a meaning which might not be accessible by strict mechanical laws of interpretation. I don't know what to think about that. Yeah.
pluralism or doctrinal.
Yeah, or at least it seems to open the way to shifting meanings, or what I sometimes call freshman Bible studies. You know, let's share what the text means to you. You know, it can mean contradictory things to different people, but we all share our meanings. Well, that's not what she was meaning, I'm sure. But, you know, I'd like to talk with her further and see how those things fit together.
Yeah, I think she qualified that by saying that it had to be in line with the tradition of the church or something.
Yeah, you need checks on it. Yeah, and I guess I want to know if it's just traditional checks. I'm sure she'd say the first check would have to be the text itself. But if you say the text itself, then you're talking about appropriate rules for handling a text. Yes. And if it's participating in the tradition of the church, then you're talking about their faithfulness to the text and what has grown out of the use of the text. Now, there may be in it, however, two further things. One is perhaps a rejection of an old distinction between interpretation and application. Okay? And Gadamer explicitly rejects any dichotomy, any complete disjunction between interpretation and application. Because if what interpretation does is to make the text for me, it's already applied in the act of interpretation. You see. The other thing may be that the suggestion is that just as the history of the church shows a history of growing theological understanding, okay, so that the history of theology begins with, for instance, an attempt to understand God, triune, Chalcedonian formulation, that develops over a period of 3 centuries, 4 centuries. And going on through the Middle Ages in trying to understand the atonement, Anselm's Cur Deus Homo, and trying to understand how we're acceptable to God, the Reformation, justification by faith. You see, that sort of growing understanding in the history of theology, things being clarified, extended as it goes on. It could be that what Aquinas is saying is that that sort of process is the case in the history of the interpretation of any passage. And just as we ascribe the development of Christian theology to the providential activity of God, so perhaps we should ascribe the history of the interpretation of a biblical passage to the providence of God. Over spring break, I was down at a college in Tennessee, and one of the people there gave me a copy of his doctoral dissertation, which was concerned with the interpretation of a certain passage in one of the Gospels that was crucial to a certain theological issue in illustrating the history of interpretation methods. Get it? Now, a large part of the thesis was simply a history of the interpretation of this passage in the Gospels. You see? And by looking at the history, the historical development of the interpretation of this one brief